Okay, in this video, I'm going to walk you guys through 2 different ways to make homemade topicals. And excuse me, my voice is kind of gone because we were at a conference, but that's all good. So a topical is like a lotion, a cream, a salve, something that you put on your skin. And you have cannabinoid receptors all over your skin, and I make a lot of homemade topicals. This is a recipe that I have not tried before, but I have made quite a few topicals in my life, so it is kind of mirroring or mimicking other recipes I've made in the past. This type of topical is different though, because I'm using already been vaped flower or AVB, and this is different than making a fresh topical with fresh cannabis flower. So with AVB, this is essentially what's left over after you've been dry herb vaping. So when you're typically making a topical, you would use fresh flower. You would have to decarboxylate it, meaning heat it up and activate it, and then you would put it into an oil. But this has already been decarboxylated, so we don't need to do that. But we still do need to get this into an oil. So I'm going to start by putting this on my stovetop with some coconut oil. That's going to melt down that coconut oil and start to extract the cannabinoids and terpenes that are left in this flower so that we can bring those into a topical. Now you might be thinking, is there actually anything left in here? Because it looks pretty dark colored. And there definitely is. The vape that I use the most often is the Volcano vape, and that goes to 230C. And we know that some heavier cannabinoids and even some terpenes are still left over even at that temperature. So some of these compounds, if we're thinking like CBE or CBT, cannabitriol or cannabisulon, I'm not sure if I say that right. But additionally, terpenes like humulene and bisbolol and caryophyllene, these heavier terpenes, some of those compounds might have been vaporized, but likely not all of them. So a lot of people use their ABV for cooking. They'll put this into chilies or something that's in a slow cooker. I don't really want to do that. I don't love eating my weed. I prefer to smoke it or use topicals. So I'm going to use a topical today, and we're going to see how this works. So again, I'm going to try actually 2 separate recipes. One is the easiest topical you can possibly make in the world. It's 3 ingredients. It's coconut oil, shea butter, and cocoa butter. And then the second one, we're actually going to incorporate a water phase as well, because personally, I prefer lotions that are really smooth and spreadable. It allows me to actually use them more often. So I'm going to be making my favorite type of lotion, but also the easy one in case you want to just make an easy one. So we'll start by putting this on the stove with the coconut oil. I'm going to use 1 cup of coconut oil. And this is, I believe, hold on, I wrote it down, 3.7 grams of dried ABV. So this is the coconut oil that I'm going to be using. It's organic, unrefined. Typically, if I'm making something like edibles or an oil, I'm actually going to use MCT oil. MCT is medium chain triglyceride coconut oil, so it's refined. This is unrefined, and I actually want it to be more in a solid state rather than the more liquid state of MCT oil. So I will be using this, and I know that coconut oil is a great solvent for extracting cannabinoids. This is how much oil that I'm using of the coconut oil, and I'm just using a small pan. Also, I'm assuming a lot of people watching this channel are chiefers, and if you are someone who's a stoner, make sure you write down what you're doing. Don't count on your brain to remember anything. I use a legitimate lab notebook, so literally every recipe that I make is in here, and I typically will make a label as well. So for instance, this is a label from a dispensary for a type of weed I used, and then this is the label that I added onto that product. So I remember exactly what those levels were at, and I highly recommend you do the same, because whether this turns out really good or really bad, you're going to want to go back and see what you did with this recipe. It's super important. All right, so I have the ABV herb upstairs on the stovetop with the coconut oil, just letting it kind of get into solution on low heat. And while we're doing that, we're going to continue on with the prepping everything else, because everything takes time. I mentioned that one of these recipes is super easy. It's shea butter, cocoa butter, and the coconut oil. So we'll do that one after. But the more complicated one involves additional ingredients. So I'm going to be using vegetable glycerin, I'm going to be using emulsifying wax, and I'm going to be using vitamin E oil. Because we have a water phase and a oil phase, you need to have emulsifying wax so that when you pour them together, they're actually able to incorporate into each other. Again, these are a bit more difficult to make than an average lotion, but it is so worth it. These two ingredients will definitely make your lotion much more silky and much more spreadable. But again, it's always nice to have a cream or a salve around. And when we're talking about creams and salves, something that does not have a water phase, you don't need to add a preservative because the molds are growing in the water. And if we're only using oil ingredients, nothing's going to grow in there. So you don't have to worry about it. But when we do have an oil and a water phase, typically people add preservatives. In my other homemade products, I've used this. It's called Germall Plus. It's been shown to be very safe, and you only need a very, very tiny amount. But with cannabis products and with other products like chaga products that I make, I typically don't need to use sometimes no preservative and sometimes just very minuscule amounts because of the levels of natural preservatives that we're adding into these ingredients. So we'll get into that in a sec, but I have distilled water here, I have vegetable glycerin, I have vitamin E oil, and I do have the Germall Plus if you do want to add that. Oh, by the way, I haven't really mentioned where we're at. This is my little like formulation station. It's also just my like ADHD project graveyard, which is what all that stuff is. But I like to keep this specific space open so that I have a place to make products. Oftentimes when things are extracting for a really long time or you need all of these ingredients or you're chopping up cocoa butter, you definitely want like space to do things. And I'm clearly in my basement here, but I actually love that because it's also my mushroom grow station and it's a really good place for keeping things out of light. Light is the biggest ruiner of projects, light and oxygen, right? It will destroy natural products. It will destroy so many things. So this is what I do. I'll actually give you guys a little span of what this looks like. So we have this wall with kind of my tools. This is for my natural dyeing. It's a natural mordant with a copper pipe. I'll do a separate video on that in the future. And then just some other stuff. But this is my home station and I love it. All right, so the water phase in this one is super, super easy. I have 18 ounces of distilled water here that I always like to give another boil just to make sure that it's good to go. And then I'm gonna add in here 2 ounces of vegetable glycerin. And I'm just using the measuring on the side of this measuring cup. So it's pretty accurate, but especially when you're making topicals, there is a little bit of leeway with your measurements. Just try to make it as close as you can get it. Excellent. All right, so I'm going to give this a little bit of a stir, and then I'm going to check on the coconut oil in the ABV to see if that's ready to strain out the bits of weed in there and take out that oil so we can mix it with the emulsifying wax and the vitamin E oil. Okay, so this has been on the stove for about an hour, and this is the coconut oil with the ABV right in it. And I am just pouring it into the strainer and actually back into the coconut oil jar that I had used the rest of. Once I do it through this rough strainer, I'm also going to strain it through cheesecloth to get out any of the other particulates. Okay, so now I'm going to prep my oil phase. So I have my oil here, but I only need 4 ounces of this. So instead, I'm going to start with the actual jar. I'm going to be mixing this all in and put 4 ounces of emulsifying wax right in there. So this is what emulsifying wax looks like. As I mentioned, the whole purpose of this is to get the oil and the water particles together, create a really smooth lotion product, and this really does add to the smoothness as well. So I'm going to weigh out 4 ounces on my scale here. All right, we got 4 ounces of that. We have our 4 ounces of oil. Our water phase is pretty much ready to go. We're going to add a little bit of vitamin E oil into this water mix as well. And I'm also going to add in some pure compounds. I almost always do. CBD and CBN from Future Compounds. If you ever want to buy single isolate compounds to supplement your recipes, highly recommend Future Compounds. I always buy from them. So I think in this recipe, I might add about 5 grams of CBD and about 1 to 2 grams of CBN. But first, I'm going to get this into a double boiler, and once everything's kind of melting together, then I'm going to weigh out my pure compounds, add them in, get that all together, get it hot, and get it ready for the emulsification process, which is essentially just us combining these together and then using a hand blender to get it all into solution. Okay, so in this double boiler top here, I have the 4 ounces of oil, and this I have the emulsifying wax. I'm going to just add those right together. And then I have a hot plate here that is heating up a pot of water. I'll give you my point of view here. And I'm going to just put that right on top and wait for it to start boiling and melting down. Once all this starts to get into solution, that's when I'm going to add in the pure compounds. Okay, we're getting there. So we have our hot oil phase. We have our water phase. And this is the CBD isolate. I need to also weigh out the CBN isolate. But I am putting this right into the oil. Remember that cannabinoids are oil soluble, so you definitely want to put them into the oil. Once this is all incorporated, which will be very soon, I'm going to directly pour this hot oil into this hot water. All right. So we have our water right here, and now our oil has been incorporated with all of these beautiful cannabinoids. And now we're going to just pour the oil right into the water. You see that immediate color change? If you did not have the emulsifying wax, this would not have worked. And something else, oh, here, wait. Something else, if you are adding fragrance, or if you are going to be adding something like this, using it as a preservative, you definitely don't want to add this right now. You want to add this last when it has cooled below 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to do this in a minute, but right now I'm just gently stirring. And I'm going to let this cool for a little bit. It's going to be super liquidy until it cools off, and then we're going to use an immersion blender to get it into solution. And as we're waiting for this to cool, let's make our other topical. Okay, this next recipe is going to be extremely easy. We're just going to add equal parts coconut oil extracted with our ABV. Then we're going to add cocoa butter and then shea butter. Equal parts, we're going to add them all together, melt them all together on the double boiler, which we still have set up here. And then once they're all melted in there, we're going to add CBD isolate again and CBN isolate again. And then we are going to just mix it all up with an immersion blender. I should mention this too. I actually didn't have enough of the oil we made, so I did supplement it with an oil that I've previously made, which is just, do I have it down here still? Yes, which is a sour diesel in MCT oil. So this is not an ABV. This is just a regular cannabis extract, equal parts. So the way I cut the shea butter is I just use a knife and just kind of pry up sections like this. Then I add these sections into the double boiler. I'm going to wait for those to melt a little bit. And then I'm adding them into my measuring cup so I make sure I have the right ratio. And then once they're all in there, I'm going to add them all back in here. And then add my CBD and CBN isolate, and then I'll immersion blend. The cocoa butter that I use comes in these little cubes, which is amazing. Doing the same thing here with the double boiler. The reason I don't add fragrance to anything I'm using cocoa butter with is because the cocoa butter smells amazing, and I don't want to ruin that. So I don't usually add fragrance. I don't really add fragrance in general, even with this product that's still cooling down. I don't want to add fragrance because I like the smell of natural things, and I like to be able for my nose to recognize things based on that smell. Okay, we still have this jar that still has the residual oil at the bottom. Our oil is fully incorporated, as we can see here. And now I'm just going to put this back in here. And I'm going to give it a quick blend with my immersion blender. You can use a regular blender too, but they get dirtier much easier, and they're so much more difficult to clean. And I believe you have a little more control with the immersion blender as well. So that's what I recommend using. That's what I'm going to be using. And after we give this one a blend, we're also going to give the other one a blend as well. As I mentioned before, you do not... Sorry. As I mentioned before, you don't need emulsifying wax here because there's nothing to emulsify. This is all oil. We're not putting any water in here. So this is just oil. So we don't need to try to get water into liquid. Instead, this is all oil. If you want to add any fragrance, you're going to want to do that once this cools down as well. This is still hot, so you don't have to. And as I mentioned before, you don't really need to use a preservative in this case, because it's all oil-based. I actually added a little bit of vitamin E oil here because I wanted to get it a little bit smoother. All right, we're going to let this one chill out for a minute. It's still very warm, so it's not going to solidify. This one's also still very warm, but you can see on the top it's starting to do something, and on the sides, that's a great sign. So I'm just going to periodically kind of give it a nice mix, and this way it's going to kind of aerate it, cool it down, and also just make sure everything stays homogeneous. I'm really excited about this one. Okay, so this is looking awesome. I just put some on my hand. It is so silky soft. It needs to set up a little bit more. I'm going to show you how I set up my actual jars, but it's important not to put it in a jar until it's pretty much cooled so it doesn't get all the condensation there and get moldy.